We like to believe that history is shaped by grand designs, massive armies, and unstoppable tectonic shifts in human civilization. But this is a comforting lie. In reality, the fate of empires, the survival of thousands of lives, and the architectural destiny of our world often hang by a single, fragile thread. A single second of hesitation, a minor calculation error, or a dropped piece of equipment can act as the first domino in a catastrophic chain reaction. This is the terrifying architecture of the butterfly effect. It is the science of how miniature human flaws can ripple through time, gather momentum, and completely rewrite human history forever. The illusion of invincibility in the sinking of the Titanic in the early 20th century, humanity believed it had finally conquered the untamed oceans. The Titanic was not merely a ship, it was a physical manifestation of industrial arrogance. Advertised as a floating fortress of steel, it represented the peak of human engineering. Yet, on the freezing night of April 14, 1912, this monument to human pride vanished beneath the North Atlantic waves. The common narrative blames a rogue iceberg, a sudden and unavoidable phantom of the deep. But history reveals a far more disturbing truth. The catastrophe was not forged by nature, but by a psychological phenomenon known as collective complacency and institutional momentum. In social psychology, institutional momentum occurs when an organization becomes so blinded by its past successes and its public reputation that it actively represses critical warning signs. The crew of the Titanic did not encounter the iceberg field blindly. They received 6 explicit, detailed wireless warnings from neighboring vessels throughout the day, including precise geographic coordinates of the looming ice danger. The ship acknowledged these warnings. Yet inside the captain's journal, a single, underlined phrase sealed the fate of 1,500 souls: no reduction of speed. To understand why a seasoned maritime commander would maintain maximum velocity while heading directly into a confirmed danger zone, we must examine the concept of systemic pressure. The White Star Line was engaged in a fierce corporate race for transatlantic dominance. Sluicing through the water at top speed was not a tactical choice. It was a public relations requirement to ensure an on-time arrival in New York City. The corporate elite prioritized social prestige over physical reality. When the lookout finally spotted the iceberg at 11:39 p.m., the ship was moving too fast to maneuver safely. In a final act of desperation, the helmsman reversed the engines and turned the ship sharply. This split-second decision triggered a structural phenomenon known as lateral shear stress. Had the Titanic hit the iceberg head-on, its reinforced bow compartments likely would have absorbed the impact, allowing the ship to survive. But by turning, the crew exposed the fragile side hull. The jagged underwater ice scraped along the steel plates, popping rivets and unzipping the ship's vital organs. The illusion of invincibility collapsed in less than 3 hours, proving that when corporate arrogance collides with physical reality, physics always wins. The dropped helmet and the fall of Sardis go back further in time to the ancient world of 547 BC. The city of Sardis, the capital of the Lydian Empire in modern-day Turkey, was widely considered the most impregnable fortress on Earth. Perched atop vertical sheer stone cliffs and guarded by massive mud brick walls, it was an architectural nightmare for any invading force. To attempt a direct siege on Sardis was considered a literal death wish. King Croesus of Lydia sat comfortably inside his mountain stronghold, confident that no army could ever breach his sanctuary. He was so secure in this belief that he had recently disbanded a large portion of his active army for the winter, assuming the high ground gave him absolute protection. But this absolute confidence bred absolute vulnerability. Enter Cyrus the Great of the Persian Empire. Recognizing that Croesus had lowered his guard, Cyrus marched his forces to the base of the cliffs. Even with a reduced garrison, the Lydians held an insurmountable geographical advantage. The Persians were stuck at the bottom of a stone wall, facing a tactical stalemate. Ancient prophecies even declared that Sardis could never be captured by human hands. The fortress was flawless, except for one unpredictable variable: the human element. One afternoon, a Persian scout named Hieroeades was monitoring the rear cliffs of the fortress. He noticed a solitary Lydian guard patrolling the highest wall. The guard, distracted or careless, accidentally leaned too far over the parapet, losing his grip on his heavy bronze helmet. The helmet tumbled down the steep rock face, bouncing through the crags until it settled at the base of the cliff. Believing he was completely unobserved, the guard made a fateful choice. Instead of abandoning the gear, he slipped through a hidden postern gate, descended a concealed, narrow pathway cut directly into the cliffside, retrieved his helmet, and climbed back up into the fortress. In that single, unscripted moment, the strategic reality of the ancient world shifted. The guard had unintentionally demonstrated a cognitive bias known as localized optimization, focusing so intensely on a minor personal goal, saving his helmet, that he completely ignored the catastrophic risk to the larger system. The Persian scout meticulously memorized every twist and turn of the guard's path. That night, a small, elite group of Persian commandos retraced the guard's footsteps, climbed the unprotected cliff face, entered the open doorway, and opened the main gates from within. The impregnable city fell within days. The entire Lydian Empire was erased from history, all because one nameless soldier went to pick up his hat. The price of command. Hitler's D-Day sleep. By June of 1944, the Nazi war machine had encased Western Europe in a brutal iron grip. The Atlantic Wall, a vast network of concrete bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions stretching thousands of miles along the coast, was designed to repel any Allied invasion. The German High Command knew an amphibious assault was imminent, but they faced a structural crisis of information asymmetry. They could not determine where the blow would fall. Adolf Hitler was convinced the Allies would land at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. Other military strategists, like Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, suspected Normandy was the true target. Because of this strategic division, Hitler instituted a highly centralized, bureaucratic command structure. He placed Germany's most powerful counterattack weapon, the elite panzer tank divisions, under his direct personal control. No regional commander could deploy these tanks without a signed, explicit order from the Führer himself. This was a classic administrative error, over-centralization of critical assets in a dynamic environment. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the horizon off the coast of Normandy filled with thousands of Allied ships. The largest amphibious invasion in human history had begun. The German forces on the beaches were overwhelmed, desperately calling for the panzer divisions to drive the Allies back into the sea. But the panzers sat idle in their depots. Why? Because Adolf Hitler was fast asleep in his private villa, having stayed up until 3 a.m. watching propaganda films. Hitler's staff was paralyzed by an organizational pathology known as fear-driven deference. The internal culture of the Nazi regime was so punitive that waking the dictator with bad news was viewed as a career-ending danger. Even as reports of massive naval bombardments flooded the command center, high-ranking officials decided it was better to let the dictator sleep until his usual waking hour of 10 a.m. for 3.5 critical hours. While the destiny of the modern world hung in the balance on the bloody sands of Omaha and Juno beaches, the German defensive strategy was completely frozen. By the time Hitler woke up, drank his coffee, and authorized the tank deployment, the Allied forces had already secured their beachheads, established deep supply lines, and begun the liberation of Europe. A dictator's sleeping habit became the Allied forces' ultimate strategic lever. The paradox of deception. The legend of the Trojan horse. The story of the Trojan horse sits at the murky intersection of ancient mythology and historical reality. While archaeologists confirm that the city of Troy existed and fell during the Late Bronze Age, the tale of the giant wooden horse remains an enduring symbol of military deception. According to historical reconstructions, the Greek army had spent 10 agonizing years laying siege to the high walls of Troy, achieving nothing but a bloody stalemate. Realizing that conventional kinetic warfare had failed, they turned to a psychological strategy of cognitive manipulation. The Greeks constructed an immense hollow wooden horse, concealed their finest warriors inside its belly, and burned their own camps. The remaining fleet sailed out of sight, leaving behind a single agent named Sinon. Sinon spun a masterful web of disinformation. He informed the Trojans that the horse was a sacred offering to the goddess Athena, built intentionally large so that the Trojans could not drag it into their city. If the horse entered Troy, Sinon claimed, it would grant the city eternal divine protection. Here, the Trojan leadership fell victim to a catastrophic cognitive vulnerability known as confirmation bias mixed with toxic opportunism. They wanted the war to be over, and they desperately wanted a symbol of total victory over their bitter rivals. Instead of viewing this massive, unexplained structure left by an enemy as a potential threat, they viewed it through the lens of their own desires. They saw it as a divine trophy. The historical mistake was not just accepting the horse. It was the active destruction of their own defenses to accommodate it. The gates of Troy were too narrow, so the citizens voluntarily tore down a section of their own protective walls to drag the wooden structure into the heart of the city. That night, while the city celebrated its supposed victory in a drunken stupor, the hidden Greek soldiers slipped out of the horse, killed the incapacitated guards, and opened the breached gates to the returned Greek fleet. The city was burned to ash. Whether literal history or profound allegory, the Trojan horse teaches an unchanging truth. The most dangerous weapon is the one you willingly bring through your own defenses. The geography of failure. The Mui-Jo chaos at the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961, the United States government attempted one of the most poorly executed covert operations in modern geopolitical history, the Bay of Pigs invasion. The strategic objective was to overthrow the communist regime of Fidel Castro in Cuba without revealing American involvement. President John F. Kennedy insisted on total plausible deniability. This political constraint fractured the entire military operation from its inception. The plan relied on an army of 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles who would land at the Bay of Pigs, establish a secure beachhead, and ignite a popular uprising among the local population. To guarantee success, the ground troops required absolute air superiority to destroy Castro's small but capable air force. The first phase involved a tactical bombing run using American B-26 bombers painted to look like stolen Cuban military aircraft. The deception failed instantly. The international community recognized the planes immediately, creating a massive political backlash for the young Kennedy administration. Panic-stricken by the threat to his international reputation, President Kennedy made a fatal executive intervention. He abruptly canceled all subsequent scheduled airstrikes. This left the exile forces on the beach completely exposed to Castro's counterattacking jets. In a desperate last-ditch effort to save the stranded troops, the CIA authorized a secret mission involving supply bombers flying out of Nicaragua, to be escorted by American fighter jets flying from an aircraft carrier in the Atlantic. This is where a minuscule administrative oversight transformed a difficult situation into a total slaughter. The coordinators in Nicaragua operated on a different time zone than the naval officers managing the aircraft carrier. The mission planners completely forgot to synchronize their clocks or account for this 60-minute discrepancy. The supply bombers arrived over the Cuban airspace exactly 1 hour early, completely unescorted. Without the protective shield of the fighter jets, the vulnerable cargo planes were easily shot out of the sky by Cuban forces. The ground invasion collapsed in 72 hours. This simple failure to check a clock solidified Castro's alliance with the Soviet Union, directly accelerating the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later. The normalization of deviance. The Challenger space shuttle on January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger disintegrated 73 seconds after liftoff, killing all 7 astronauts on board live on national television. It remains one of the most traumatic engineering failures in human history. In the aftermath, a special presidential commission was formed to uncover the physical cause of the disaster. They discovered that a small rubber seal, known as an O-ring, located in the right solid rocket booster, had failed due to the unusually cold Florida weather. But the true revelation of the investigation was not mechanical, it was cultural. Sociologist Diane Vaughan analyzed the internal communications of NASA and coined a terrifying term that every modern leader must understand: the normalization of deviance. This phenomenon occurs when people within an organization become so accustomed to a recurring technical flaw or safety violation that they stop viewing it as a dangerous risk, accepting it as a normal operational variance. Months before the launch, senior engineer Roger Boygely and his team at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the rocket boosters, discovered that the rubber O-rings lost their elasticity and failed to seal properly when exposed to temperatures below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Boygely wrote an urgent, detailed internal memo to NASA management, explicitly stating that if these seals failed, superheated gases would escape the booster, act like a blowtorch against the main fuel tank, and cause a catastrophic explosion. NASA ignored the warnings. The agency was under intense political pressure to maintain a packed launch schedule to justify its federal funding. Because previous launches had succeeded despite minor O-ring erosion, management assumed the system was resilient enough to handle the risk. On the morning of the launch, the temperature was a freezing 36 degrees. The engineers begged NASA to delay the launch, but their managers told them to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. The rocket launched, the cold rubber cracked, the hot gas escaped, and 7 brilliant minds were lost because an institution normalized a lethal flaw. The positive feedback loop of Chernobyl, the word Chernobyl, has become synonymous with the apocalyptic potential of human error. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine suffered a catastrophic steam explosion and open-air reactor fire, releasing 40 times more radioactive fallout into the atmosphere than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The economic, political, and ecological cost of this single event contributed directly to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The disaster was triggered during a routine, low-power safety test. Ironically, the test was designed to determine if the reactor's turbines could generate enough residual electricity to power the cooling pumps during a blackout. The test was originally scheduled for the highly trained daytime shift. However, due to an unexpected power demand from a regional grid controller, the test was delayed by 9 hours, pushing it directly onto the unprepared night shift. The night shift operators had less than an hour to read the complex safety protocols. They possessed almost no experience managing a reactor at low power levels. To make matters worse, the Soviet state operated under a culture of absolute secrecy. The design flaws of the RBMK reactor type were classified as state secrets, meaning the very men operating the machine did not fully understand its internal physics. The defining flaw of the Chernobyl reactor was a phenomenon known as a positive void coefficient. In most Western nuclear plants, reactors are designed with a negative feedback loop. If the coolant boils away, the nuclear reaction naturally slows down and dies out. But Chernobyl was engineered with a positive feedback loop. When the water boiled into steam voids, it actually increased the speed of the nuclear reaction. This generated more heat, which created more steam voids, which increased the reaction further, causing an exponential, uncontrollable spiral of thermal energy. When the operators realized the danger and pressed the emergency shutdown button, the boron control rods, which had flawed graphite tips, jammed in the core, accelerating the reaction to over 100 times its maximum capacity in a fraction of a second. The machine tore itself apart from the inside out. The serendipity of negligence, the discovery of penicillin. To close this dark ledger of human history, we must examine a rare moment where human carelessness did not result in a mountain of bodies, but instead saved over 200 million lives. In September of 1928, a Scottish physician and bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returned to his London laboratory after a month-long vacation with his family. Fleming was a brilliant scientist, but he was also notoriously untidy, often leaving his laboratory workbenches cluttered with unwashed equipment. Before leaving for his holiday, Fleming had been cultivating colonies of Staphylococcus aureus, a deadly flesh-eating bacterium responsible for severe infections. Rather than properly sterilizing his petri dishes or placing them inside an incubator, he simply left a stack of them exposed to the open air on a bench in the corner of his room. When he returned on a Monday morning, he began sorting through the contaminated dishes to throw them away. He noticed something bizarre on one specific culture plate. A stray mold spore, likely drifting through an open window or up from a lower floor, had landed on the agar gel and grown into a large colony. But the area immediately surrounding the mold was completely clear. The deadly bacteria colonies that should have been growing there had been completely dissolved and erased. Fleming did not view this contaminated dish as a failed experiment. He recognized a profound biological anomaly. He isolated the mold, identified it as Penicillium notatum, and discovered that it secreted a powerful substance capable of destroying pathogenic bacteria without harming human tissue. This accidental discovery gave birth to modern antibiotics, transforming infections that were once an automatic death sentence into minor medical inconveniences. Had Fleming been a perfectly meticulous, clean scientist who followed every standard laboratory protocol, the petri dish would have been washed, the mold would never have grown, and the greatest medical breakthrough of the 20th century would have been lost down the sink drain. Every Tom kicked we have dissected today reveals a profound truth about our world. The systems we build are only as strong as our willingness to look at our own flaws. Whether it is an engineer warning NASA about a freezing rubber ring, or a scientist looking closely at a ruined petri dish, human progress relies on breaking through the illusions of our own invincibility. History is not an unchangeable path laid out by giants. It is a fragile structure built by everyday choices, checked clocks, and open ears. The next time you are tempted to ignore a small warning sign in your life, your career, or your work, remember the city walls of Sardis and the cold waters of the Atlantic. Do not let your complacency become the first domino in your own chain reaction. What do you think is the most dangerous hidden flaw in our modern world today? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to dive deeper into the hidden science of history, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our community at Shadow Science DD. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next episode.